Hello everyone, this is Rajarshi Sengupta and we are here in the week 8 of our course, and this is the final week of our course, as you know. So this week we'll be talking about textiles and contemporary art practice in India. So as you can see in this concluding module, or in the concluding week, we'll be looking into some of the practices surrounding textiles in the contemporary art field in India. That means that the kind of art practices that we see mostly in the second half of the 20th century after India's independence, and of course towards the end of 20th century and until today, that what kind of practices that we see in the contemporary art field. And as we know that in the contemporary art field there have been a lot of transitions, and those transitions we see from in terms of the medium specificity, how we see that a certain kind of material or certain kind of practices, for example like painting on canvas, oil on canvas, or making sculptures in the much more sort of stable and traditional media, for example bronze, terracotta and things like that, how the medium specificity in the field of art making that had changed so far, and then different ways in which we see that how medium, our intellect, our sensibility, all those things sort of collide with each other in the art practice that has been explored in the field of contemporary art practice lately. So in this cases we certainly see that textiles play a very important role in terms of pushing these perceptions about how medium, material, and then of course the thinking process, concept and context, all those things, they sort of come together. And then also thinking about what is the politics of a particular medium, or what is the politics of a particular material. So we have these implications before as well, but then today we see these things much more sort of brought up in a much more rigorous way in the art practice as well as in the scholarship around art practice in India. Now, so those are the kind of the larger perimeters for our discussion this week, and so we'll start the discussion with understanding that textile as a medium of contemporary art and textile in contemporary art. So now what is the difference between these two phrases? So textile as a medium of contemporary art, when we talk about it, we understand that how this medium specificity that I have already started talking about in terms of painting, sculpture, graphics, printmaking, and then the other allied practices. In this case we see that how textile as something that was long categorized as a medium of craft expressions, then how we see that some of the artists, they have challenged these notions. Artist, when I say artist, I mean the artists who are trained in art institutions in India, metropolitan artists, and then they have sort of ventured out to understand this understanding between craft and art. Otherwise we see a number of designers, and then of course there are non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and many other organizations in which we see this overlapping between the boundaries of art and craft. All those things are challenged, but in this week we'll primarily focus on the trained artist, and of course some of the artists who come from a background of traditional textile making, and then how we see that their presence in the metropolitan spheres, they have made us think about the status of textile in the contemporary society in a different way. So when we say that textile is a medium of contemporary art, so we try to acknowledge that how the materiality of textile, some of the innate characteristics, so for example the malleability of textile, and then the way it is constructed, so it can be folded, or it can be packed in a particular way, or it can also be displayed in a particular way. All those characters are acknowledged, and then they are made as part of contemporary art practice. And some of the overarching themes that we see in the contemporary art field are also something that we see them to be reflected in the way that some of those exploration of the material characters of textiles. So those kind of aspects we see when we try to acknowledge that textile as a medium of contemporary art. So we are trying to see some of the innate characteristics in textile, and we are seeing some of the innate characteristics of the ongoing contemporary art activities, and we try to sort of see the interrelations between them. So this is how we see that how textile can work as an effective medium of contemporary art. Now, textile in contemporary art means something slightly different. So textile in contemporary art, by that I mean that a number of artists, we find them to have used textile as part of their practice and not textile based works. So those things we can also say in terms of that, I mean, how textile fragments are used in many people's works, and also in the other way that how textile and then like I mean the studies from textile, how that generates a new kind of dialogue, and maybe the resultant artwork that comes out of this research, or this comes out of this exploration about the characteristics of textiles, a particular kind of textile, that can be in a different medium altogether. It can be on paper, it can be in the form of animation, anything. But then how textile that started the this discussion about art making, and that gets infused into the other kind of expressions. So that is what we'll be looking at when we say that textile in contemporary art. So with this distinctions, or like I mean perhaps like I mean this two set of practices, will be continuing our discussion to the other issues that we have. So in this week we'll also look into like I mean some of the of course that I mean there will be a lot of examples, but some of the cases we'll be looking at much more closely. For example, Nilima Sheikh's textile like scrolls we'll be looking at, and then Shruti Mahajan's transference of weaving metaphors into paper. So this two case studies will be looking at that how some of those ideas from textile, they are then like I mean brought into paper, or like I mean associated media, and then what happens to them. Like if someone is using certain metaphors or certain characters of textile into paper or into a medium that is not textile, then does that do justice to textile, or like I mean does that actually help us to understand this overarching sort of relevance of textile beyond its materiality? So those are the kind of questions we'll be delving into as part of this discussion this week. Then we'll also look into the contemporary dyed textiles of Mallipuddu Kailasham and Ajit Das. So these two artists will be looking at, and very difficult it is for us to sort of call them as whether artist or artisan or just dye painter, and that's because the kind of like I mean background we see for them, they do not come from this metropolitan educated art school pass out artist, but then we see them that they have come from certain background that enable them to practice textile making in a particular way, and then with time, with experience, with exposure, and of course with their deep understanding of this medium, they have managed to transform their textile making into a different level altogether. And those are the aspects we'll be looking at when we consider the dyed textile making of Mallipuddu Kailasham and Ajit Das. Then we'll also look into textile as part of performance art. So perhaps we'll be looking at this aspect, that the textile as part of performance art so after Nilima Sheikh and Shruti Mahajan's transference of the textile metaphors, because we can see that I mean there are, I mean in one hand we can certainly see that performance art, this one particular way of expressing ourselves, and we can also consider it as a category of contemporary art practice, and that had gained its significance or its importance at least since the 1970s in USA and in the North Atlantic world. And by the late 20th century, by the end of 20th century and early 21st century, performance art has picked in the Indian contemporary art scene as well. So what do we see in terms of performance art, and how does that differ from the medium specific art practice? That's something that I have already mentioned in the beginning of our discussion today. So performance art is something in which we see some of the basic notions about art objects or art practice is denied. So for example, when we understand art, we usually understand something that is collectible, we understand something that is tangible, and by collectible and tangible, that mean that the resultant object, or like the resultant the resultant of a entire process can be understood in terms of an object. So for example, if I think about painting as a process, oil on canvas as a process, then the painted canvas that comes out of this entire process, this rectangular or square, whatever the shape of the canvas is the outcome of this process that we understand, that is tangible, that can be displayed in a gallery space, and that can eventually be collected by either a collector or a museum or an institute. So this kind of aspects, we see them to be ingrained in the making of art objects, at least since the mid 19th century in Europe and in the North Atlantic world. And as we know, for our long legacy of colonialism, and from the mid 19th century, we also have a number of art institutions being established in the Indian subcontinent, and for that reason the colonial education that still plays a very important role in shaping our idea about art, and also like training our minds in terms of understanding what is art, what is not. So for those reasons, this idea about the tangibility of the art object, what kind of object is considered as art, all those things, we see them to be equally relevant in South Asia, the ideas which were there in Western Europe or in the North Atlantic world. So this kind of things, we see them to be sort of countered when we see the emergence of performance art in the 1970s, because by that time, after the World War II, we see that there were a number of questions in terms of the role of capitalism, the role of market economy, and then also the role of artist. So whether the artist should always feed into this capitalist market system, which is all about collecting, and also like how this transactional relationship between the buyers, the artist, and the audience, that sort of continues. So there were a set of artists, we find them to have opposed this way, and they have come up with certain kind of art practices which do not really result into a tangible art form. So that is what we see that to be as a performance. Now performance art is something that is again different from performing art. Now performing art is, we understand in terms of singing, musical performances, dance, theater, and so on, which has been long established. Now performance art does not really claim to have that kind of training or like this kind of a rehearsed way of performing in a particular stage, but performance art is something we see that to be somewhere in between producing an object and then of course being trained in performance. So it is somewhere in between. It kind of presents a narrative, a fragmented narrative, or an experience of the artists to the audience, but it does not really conclude in a particular fashion. So this kind of the lack of conclusion for making people explore the different ways of understanding a particular situation or a particular problem is something that is prioritized in performance art. Then we see that the way it was established in the 1970s, or it gained its importance in the 1970s, we see that it does not make any tangible outcome through this process. Only the documentation of it through photographic documentation, video documentation, that remains, but then the entire performance that takes place, that is not really collected in any archive. So those kind of aspects we see that to be part of performance art. Now the other very important aspect of performance art we also see and that would be to do with interaction with audience. Now what we see in terms of a number of traditional art making, and when I say traditional art making, I sort of like, I mean, maybe trace the tradition of this kind of art making back to mid 19th century in Western Europe, in which we see how art making is something that is associated with a particular kind of course, like a particular kind of audience, that art objects are something that cannot be displayed on the roadside. Art objects are something that cannot have a ready place for display, but it has to be approved by particular institutions, particular galleries or spaces which are again dominated by social elites, and if those are then validated, they are considered as art objects. So this kind of like, I mean, aspects we see, and of course, like in the early 20th century, this ideas got more and more consolidated in the flight of the avant-garde. We see that to be there in the Western Europe, and in which we see that the art objects are something that is considered to be there on the walls of the gallery, and a lot of times we are supposed to see it from a distance and not touch it, or like, I mean, be close to it, because it is considered to be something that is almost sacred, that is there on the walls, and the viewers should be in a safe distance from them. The similar kind of strategy we can still see in a number of museum settings as well, and that can be for security reasons, but also at the same time this gap that needs to be maintained between the object and the viewer is something that also adds to the aura of the artwork. So this kind of aspects we see that to be there when the art objects are created, they are displayed and they are appreciated. Now what happens in terms of an interactive process, and what we see in terms of in the performance art in the 1970s and later on, that we see that the artist frequently reach out to the viewers or the audience. They either talk to them or sort of like, I mean, allow the viewers to touch them or exchange notes, and then like, I mean, they act upon it. So those kind of aspects, so it's kind of like breaking down this gap that we have between object and viewers and the artist, this almost this invisible gap that cannot be sort of fulfilled. So those kind of things we see that to be countered in the performance art. And so if we try to like, I mean, bring some of these key points together and understand that, I mean, what are some of those salient features of performance art, at least what we see from 1970s, we see this stress on not producing something as a tangible outcome of a process was there, that was prioritized. And then we see this high aspect of interaction between art objects, artist, viewers. Those aspects are also something that is sort of prioritized, and by doing that they have managed to sort of counter or oppose some of those institutional hierarchy those were established in the field of modern art making in the mid 20th century and so on. But then of course, I mean, when we see that, I mean, those kind of practices started, they did not really remain the same way as we see in the 1970s, and then we have definitely sort of moved away from that, I mean, what kind of tangible outcome we are thinking about, what kind of aspects of documentation and archiving about performance is now sort of there as part of this kind of art processes. But then in all this we see that, I mean, in certain case studies, in works of certain artists, that textile plays a very important role. I mean, the artist, the performance artist will be looking at in the Indian context, they do not claim themselves to be performance artists as such, but then what we see that, I mean, textile plays a very important role, and perhaps because of its innate quality of border crossing. And that's because what we see in terms of this, that how border crossing is something that is very much involved in textiles, that it is foldable, and then like, I mean, it's malleable, but also at the same time it can be sturdy, and for all those opposing characters, those are already there in textiles. that sort of makes it receptible to different kind of changes and different kind of transformations that can take place in the field of contemporary art making. And for those reasons, we find that a number of performance artists have also incorporated textiles as part of their practices and continued this discussion about what is the role of textiles in contemporary art practice in India today. So with that, we'll be sort of looking into some of the examples, as I have already mentioned, and perhaps that, I mean, when we talk about that, I mean, textile as a medium of contemporary art, textile in contemporary art, then we see that, I mean, there are a number of approaches those were taken by artists, and then those approaches are something we see that to be there, how that sort of made a difference in terms of how textiles are looked at. So one thing we definitely see that how the post independence India, the kind of institutions those were established, we see that in the 1949-1950, around this time, the Maharaja Sajirao University, that is well known for fine arts education in Gujarat, that was established, and that sort of like, I mean, took the discussion about the how the contemporary art would move in or like, I mean, proceed in the Indian context, and it kind of took the lead of sort of like, I mean, continuing this discussion, this particular institution, and in which we see that some of this medium specific education, those are there in terms of understanding painting, sculpture, graphics, and so on, ceramics, and so on. But then, like, I mean, we see that it's not just one institute, but then like in many other institutes. So for example, the government schools of art which were established in the colonial period and so on, in a lot of those cases we see that how textile is something that is usually not understood as part of contemporary art practice. Now then, there are also institutes like this alternative school that Tagore established in Shantiniketan, Vishwa Bharati, and there we also have like the Department of Design, in which textile design and all those things are taught. But then that is also something we do not really see that to be directly associated with the way we understand contemporary art making today. So with all those differences and similarities, we definitely see that there is a boundary. Those are created by institutes, those are created by colonial education system, and then those were conveniently continued by the Indian institutions in the post-independence era as well. Then when we also see that some of the design institutes that came into being, for example, in the 1960s we see NID, National Institute of Design, and then later on in the 1980s we see NIFT, the National Institute of Textile Fashion Technology. So in terms of like, I mean, NIFT and NID, we definitely see that have this institutions, they have produced a number, like several of the successful designers they are working today in India, but then they are considered as designers and hardly they are considered as artists. And with this, I mean, even though in terms of like the experimentation, we might find that the designers' works are they can certainly be considered as art objects, as if we sort of like, I mean, go by certain ideas about what constitutes the idea of an art object. But then for this kind of classification that we have, that is continuing since the colonial period, we do not consider them as artists unless we are challenged. So those kind of binary we definitely see. And so today when we look into a number of those case studies, we'll be looking at a number of people from different background and try to see that how their art practices or so-called art practices that made this kind of questions much more evident for the viewers, for us to reflect on these issues in a much more productive way. So we'll start our discussion with artist Mrinalini Mukherjee, and who was trained in Shantiniketan, and of course after that she was trained in the school in Baroda, MSU. So like these two elite art institutions that we see that there, and she was part of both of those places. She was trained in painting, mural making, and eventually got interested in making sculptures. When we see that she was getting interested in making sculptures, so instead of thinking that like how sculpture is associated with this hard and like stable material, we see that she was more and more interested in exploring fiber. And by fiber I mean like some of the indigenous fiber materials. So for example, hemp, which is called shon in Bangla, and then this is something we see that, I mean, how she got more and more interested in knotting. It's a particular way of making textile, this macrame, and something that had existed in the history for a longest period of time. And she definitely did not really make textile in terms of like, I mean, sitting in a loom and weaving it, but she was more interested in hand knotting this fibers, the bunches of fiber, and then making them into sculptures that we see it here. And a lot of those sculptures we see that to be there gigantic in size, but then they are also foldable because they are made of textile. They are also malleable, and that's because like, I mean, it is made of this flexible material, and hemp is slightly sort of like, I mean, rougher in comparison to cotton or silk. But then what we see that, I mean, this particular kind of character of this fiber that had given both the sturdiness but also at the same time the flexibility of handling this kind of material. So with those, we see that Mrinalini Mukherjee in the 1970s, she started working on this kind of knotted sculptures. And so in one hand we see that she called these works as sculptures, she named them very specifically, but at the same time we see that some of the basic characters of sculpture that we have, for example, its tangibility. I mean, of course these are also tangible, but then they are not permanent as a bronze sculpture or a metal sculpture. So the permanence of this kind of forms, or like, I mean, the sturdiness, and then like, I mean, of course this also relate to the gender roles, that, I mean, how the stable material is something that is more associated with masculinity than femininity. And she sort of managed to delve into these details and using certain material which can surpass this kind of fraud boundaries. And what we see that, I mean, when she made this sculpture, so for example in the left side of the screen we have this one sculpture, and that is, it's a hemp made sculpture, and this is called Vanaraja, the king of the forest, and in which we see that how this hemp made sculpture is something that can be installed in a particular way, and through that the figure can be revealed. But then if it is folded, then we cannot really appreciate the way it was made. So there is a particular way in which it needs to be displayed, there is a particular way it needs to be unfolded and then kept in a way. And even though this is made of malleable material, we see the kind of grandeur it has because of its monumental scale, and it sort of also make us think about the iconic deity figures in the Indian context. So she is clearly drawing from the totemic figures, the sculptural objects from the Indian history, but then transforming them into a material that we see that to be not traditionally associated with sculpture making. And with this knowledge, when she went back to making bronze sculptures, we see that, I mean, this fragmentary idea of making small strips of wax and then putting them together in a way in which it can be molded into a piece is also there, informed by her way of textile making. So this is how we find that Mrinalini Mukherjee was successful in terms of surpassing the boundary between something that is much more sturdy, tangible, and something that is much more malleable and flexible. We'll continue this discussion more in the coming lecture. Thank you.